Hello everybody, wherever you are in the world. My name is Adam Bates. Good to be with you. And we're going to be hearing from somebody called Thandeka Khoza in a moment, who is going to be delivering a talk on children in armed conflict. Really happy to see so many people in the room. So Thandeka is a doctoral researcher at the Dullah Omar Institute in Cape Town, South Africa. Originally from Durban, she's also a published author after writing about the economic gains of educating girls from a human rights perspective. At this summit, she's already contributed to a panel discussion on prisoners' rights in Africa by talking about the issue of criminal justice. Now she's here to share her knowledge on children in armed conflict. So she'll now give her talk, and then in the second half of this session, she'll be taking questions. So if you have any thoughts or questions you'd like to share, please do post them in the private chat. So welcome, Thandeka. Over to you.
Thanks, Adam. Good morning, everybody. Am I clear to everyone? Okay, perfect. So just before I start, can everyone please turn off their microphones? And then, yeah, whether you have your camera on is up to you, but just your microphone. Thank you. And then just in case you didn't see Adam's message as well, he's already told everyone that we can all post our questions in the chat. Okay, so like Adam said, my name is Thandeka Khoza. I'm based in Cape Town. I'm a doctoral researcher on children's rights at the Dullah Omar Institute. And we're just going to have a little chat about children affected by armed conflict on the African continent. So I've titled my talk, The Theory and Reality of Article 22, Subarticle 2 of the African Charter on the Rights and Welfare of the Child, Children Still Affected by Armed Conflict. The reason I refer to it in this manner is because there is a reason, as we will discuss, that this article was drafted. However, it hasn't achieved what it was drafted to achieve. Secondly, when we speak about children and armed conflict, we're always saying children affected by armed conflict. But considering when the article was written and adopted and where we are right now, that's why I still say children still affected by armed conflict, because they're not supposed to be affected by this time. So let's begin by looking at the charter. So obviously the most important article for today's talk is Article 22, Subarticle 2, which states that state parties to the charter shall take all necessary measures to ensure that no child takes direct participation in hostilities, and state parties must also refrain particularly from recruiting any child. Right, so keywords there are direct participation and refraining from recruiting any child. This article needs to be read in conjunction with Articles 2 and 4 of the African Children's Charter. So Article 2 defines who a child is. So unlike the CRC, where the CRC does allow for contexts in which children can be defined as someone under 18, the African Children's Charter states that categorically that in all instances, the child is anyone who is under 18 years of age, and it was drafted in such categorical terms, particularly because of the issues on the continent at that time, which are still persisting, such as child soldiering, child marriage, harmful traditional and cultural practices on the continent. Article 4 is the best interest principle, which is also stronger than the CRC, because the CRC says that the best interest of the child shall be a consideration, whereas the African Children's Charter says the best interest of the child is the primary consideration when dealing with any issues relating to the child. So we argue that it's a stronger protection than the CRC. So the best interest principle is not a trump card, whereas you just state Article 4 and then everything else falls away. No, however, it is non-disposable and it is imperative. It is the first consideration in anything dealing with the child, including child soldiering. So then what was the raison d'etre, or the reason for being of Article 22? So again, at the time of adoption, which was in 1990, the recruitment of child soldiers or children into armed conflict was not unusual. And I deliberately say not unusual because it's only recently actually that children have, it's become more fashionable to have child soldiers. So we've always had child soldiers, but now it seems that especially armed groups are cranking it up and they're deliberately going out to get even more child soldiers, and we'll touch on why they're doing this a little bit later. So the other reason why, another reason for being is the fact that the children needed to be protected from armed conflict then and in the future. So part of the future of 1990 is the present where we are, and I will discuss the current status quo to show that we're actually behind, right? So we're still living in the theory of Article 22, Sub-Article 2. So just to define a few selected terms in the language of armed conflict, as I've already stated, a child is any person under the age of 18. Armed conflict refers to a contested incompatibility which concerns a government. It can be international, where it's between two states, or it can be non-international, where it's, for example, between a state and an armed group. So for example, the conflict between the state of Nigeria versus Boko Haram, that is a non-international armed conflict. But where, for example, we'd have Uganda versus DRC, that is an international armed conflict. Right now in Africa, we have plenty non-international armed conflicts dotted all over in every region, right? Especially Central Africa and West Africa. So then we also have actors who are either government forces or armed groups, following on from the definition of armed conflict. And then we also have recruitment and involvement. So recruitment refers to the action of enlistment. So usually with regard to child soldiers, it is through incentives, conquest, coercion, threat, or children volunteer themselves. We need to use this word very loosely. They volunteer themselves because of socio-political or socio-economic factors. So for example, in the northern parts of Nigeria, as well as in South Sudan, right, a lot of children will volunteer themselves because in that area that they are found in, they are unhappy with the state, but they believe in or they are made to believe in the beliefs of a certain armed group. And so, or they live in poverty, for example, and that armed group can give them security and or an income. And so then they join that armed group. However, we can't really say that it's completely voluntary, especially when we take into consideration the socio-political and socio-economic factors, which are the sine qua non of their joining the armed forces. Then we move on to involvement. So this is participation in conflict, right, or hostilities. And this can be through shooting, training, driving, cooking, spying, engineering, and more recently, it's more fashionable to use children for suicide bombings as well. Children are also used especially by terrorist groups, they're also used, they're forced into child marriage and or sex trafficking or sex slavery. Now, why are children recruited? Well, because they're cheaper to maintain, they're more malleable, easier to train and transport, and change their beliefs. And they also draw international attention. That is why it's become more fashionable for children to be used by armed groups. Because if we, for example, think about the Chibok girls, right? The whole world knew about the Chibok kidnapping. And that is exactly why Boko Haram used that particular strategy. And since then, a lot of other armed groups have been using that strategy, and even more attention has been drawn to it. So for example, if you go through the Special Rapporteur's reports, annual reports, you'll see that there is more on child soldiers now as compared to before. So now let's talk about the past and the present status quo, the current status quo. So armed conflicts, as I already stated, are dotted all over Africa, like right now, and terrorism has made things even worse. So whereas when at the time of drafting, really the terrorist capital of Africa was Sudan, and that's where a lot of stuff was going on, right? But it didn't really involve children. Now we have armed conflicts, especially regarding terrorism, that are dotted all over the continent. In North Africa, all along the Maghreb, we have them. So for example, in Tunisia, Libya, Mali, even Algeria. Whereas it used to be about 30 years ago, it was just the AQIM in Algeria. Now it's spread throughout the Maghreb. In West Africa, all over the Lake Chad Basin region. So we have Cameroon, the Central African Republic, Chad, Niger, Nigeria, all involved in armed conflict. In East Africa and in the Horn of Africa, we have especially the DRC, Kenya, and Somalia. So this is all armed conflicts, non-international armed conflicts that are going on right now. Okay, like in 2020, and they've all been reported on from the year of 2019. Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot Sudan and South Sudan as well. There are armed conflicts in the south of Sudan, as well as in the independent state, South Sudan. Some conflicts are not terrorist related per se, but they're also because of resources. So for example, in the Central African Republic, the DRC, and previously in Sierra Leone, the armed conflicts there were not really based on, the terrorism notions of governance, okay? So for example, Boko Haram is not fighting to control resources or to trade in resources. They're fighting the governance of the state. However, in the DRC and the CAR, for example, they are fighting because of resources. That is the cause of the armed conflict, okay? So we have different types of armed conflict, but we do have armed conflict that is persistent throughout the continent. Some governments, unfortunately, so you'll remember when I was defining the contents of Article 22.2, it says that governments should, in particular, refrain from recruitment of children into their forces. However, some governments are still recruiting children, okay? Oftentimes they save children from armed groups, and instead of rehabilitating them, they now use them to still shoot for them, so direct hostilities, or they also use them as spies, for example, so they're always endangering them. So three examples of this, for example, are Nigeria. Nigeria has set up the Civilian Joint Task Force, which is supposed to fight against, terrorist groups, and they have been reported to use children in that task force. The governments of Somalia and South Sudan also recruit child soldiers. Now, internationally speaking, the UN, especially by creating the Special Rapporteur on Children Affected by Armed Conflict, the international community of the Red Cross and Save the Children have made efforts to prevent armed conflict, as well as assist those who are affected by armed conflict during conflict and post-conflict. The African Committee of Experts on the Rights and Welfare of the Child, unfortunately, is very behind on its efforts, very, very behind. They only established a special rapporteur on children affected by armed conflict in 2017. They have posted only one area study, which they posted in 2016. They are now making more efforts. They're in the process of coming up with a general comment on Article 22, as well as a background study on terrorism, and finally a model law on children affected by armed conflict. But these are all things that are only just happening, whereas the other people at the international level have been doing a lot more for a longer time. Domestically speaking, some countries have fought back, as in they've gone to combat. Some countries have changed their laws so that you can't recruit children. Some of them have criminalized it. So that is fantastic. So there is a criminal sanction if you recruit children, and others have established rehabilitation programs and centers for those children who have been saved from armed groups, for example, to then receive help and be reintegrated into their communities. However, all around, these efforts need to be strengthened. So, of course, I have to speak about COVID-19 because, of the time that we're living in. However, I can say it in one sentence that there is very little evidence that COVID-19 has had any bearing at all on conflict or children affected by armed conflict, especially in terms of hostilities. The situation has not really changed for children. However, I do personally worry about all the children who have not been reached. So, for example, humanitarian aid conventions, which have had to be halted, because of COVID-19. And I also worry about any children who may have fallen ill and they were not able to reach any sort of assistance because of COVID-19. So what is the problem in Africa, right? Articles 22 and 4 of the African Children's Charter make it clear that it's not in the best interest of the child for the child to be recruited into armed conflict in any way. But nothing in Article 22 protects all children. Sub-Article 2, the one that says they should not be recruited, has the strongest protection, however, even it falls short. So what is, for example, direct participation in hostilities, right? The old definition of this, I'm just going to take a minute or two to wrap up. I see my time is done. The old definition of this was that, you know, you must be in the line of combat, you must be shooting. However, if we take it so literally, we can't take it so literally. We have to interpret it broadly so that we include the children who are also cooks, engineers, spies, or even, you know, the sex slaves or the children who are forced into child marriage. In my opinion, that is also direct participation in armed conflict. And this is how we need to interpret Article 22.2. So again, what of the children who were affected but not recruited, right? So for example, the children who don't end up being child soldiers or don't end up being part of an armed group, but they have been orphaned because of armed conflict, they have been internally displaced, they have been turned into refugees or have been injured or have been murdered. Again, what of those whose rights have to health, to education, development, housing, nutrition, survival, and whose rights have been affected by armed conflict? And, you know, armed groups love to bomb hospitals and schools, for example. So again, all-round rehabilitation and reintegration efforts need a lot of work, and we must have mechanisms and they must be effective. So governments going forward need to lead by example, first of all. They need to stop recruiting children into their official forces. Governments need to send troops to their country's hotspots, and governments know which are the hotspots. For example, there's no way that the government of DRC does not know that the hotspot of their armed conflict is happening in the east, in the Kivu regions, right? There's no way that they don't know, but we asked ourselves, why are they not focusing on sending troops over there? We also need intergovernmental collaborations, like in the Lake Chad Basin, where all the countries are working together to stop terrorism and armed conflict collectively. Governments also need to somehow clamp down on the armed group streams of income, especially where armed conflicts are happening because of resources. And they need to establish and maintain effective rehabilitation centers. Finally, the African Children's Committee of Experts also needs to, you know, I think they've started or came pretty late to the party, but it's good. They're moving in the right direction, and they will have to work now to ensure that whatever they're working on now, they implement and they follow up on. Thank you. Thanks, Adam.
Thank you so much, Thandeka. That is very engaging. And so everybody here, you've heard what Thandeka has had to say. I'm sure it was revealing for a lot of you, as it was for me. So now is your opportunity to get your questions in. So you can see the private chat there, and any questions or comments that you have, just put them there and we'll be able to put them to Thandeka. So Tabang has already said this was good and well detailed. Thank you. So I've got plenty of questions to ask you. And the first one, Thandeka, if Antonio Guterres, the UN Secretary General, picked up the phone to you and said, I've had enough now, would you take my job? What would be the first thing you'd look to do with that new level of influence?
Wow. I think the first thing that I would do is engage with governments regarding their efforts on the ground and regarding their efforts to cut the sources of income. So my theory, it's sort of a, what do you call it? The word escapes me now, but my theory is that governments, in some cases, unfortunately, governments also have something to gain, right, from armed conflict, even if they're not a party to it. So for example, in some areas, it's two armed groups fighting against each other and the government is not doing anything. But I think that governments, I would make sure that, or I would engage with governments more to make sure that they send troops to certain areas, and we need to bring this thing back where we have the UN troops. So for example, Ethiopia has sent a lot of UN troops to Somalia as well as Kenya. We need to do that in other areas as well. We need to actually have active combat. I'm sorry I'm saying this, but we need to have active combat because that's not happening, right? It's sort of like a game of fear and a game of who's going to make the first move. But on the armed conflict, on the armed group side, I personally think they're chilling because they know that no one's going to come for them. If you look at Nigeria, for example, I firmly believe that the government has all the might to deal with Boko Haram. I firmly believe this. And because Boko Haram is based in Nigeria, but working in the whole Lake Chad region, if they all those governments come together effectively and they're serious about themselves, I think that they can actually, you know, get rid of Boko Haram. Another thing, like I said, is that the sources of income, we need to clamp down on the sources of income. We know where each group's sources of income come from. So governments need to say, okay, this is where we're pinching it. We need to, because they won't survive without the money. We know that for sure. So I would engage on governments on those two particular points, as well as the recruitment, of course, because governments are also still recruiting child soldiers, and it's not only in the areas where there are armed conflicts. So for example, Eritrea, I think they've only recently changed their laws. They are still, if not, they're still recruiting child soldiers. And then everything I said is to do with Africa, but the Middle East has similar or worse cases as well.
Wow. You don't hold back. You've got the plan there, so you should get on the phone to Antonio Guterres and say, hey, and we've got a question here from Thabang. I just wondered, Thabang, would you like to actually come on and share it yourself?
That's okay. Hi, Thandeka. Hi, Adam. Thank you again for the great presentation, Thandeka. I just think it's easy to think the kids are being recruited and they're just going, right? But working with people on the ground, you sometimes find that the children aren't really given a choice. You know, it's an issue of, if you don't become a part of this group, your family's in danger, they're going to be killed and stuff like that. So it's sort of like saying my life for my family's life, right? And I'm a layman here, so you can definitely say, no, that's not the case, that's fine. And also I'm thinking for some of them, there's an issue of starvation, food insecurity, right? So they think if I become a part of this group, at least I'm assured 3 meals or 2 meals a day, you know. And the issue for some boys is about you look manly or you're taken as manly if you're part of these groups. So my question is just, while of course we direct approaches would be get them out, stop recruitment, right? But don't you think maybe like long-term or sustainable approaches would involve addressing some of the reasons why the children end up getting there? Like I said, food security, education, and stuff like that. Just, yeah.
Thank you, Thabang. So you'll recall I said that sometimes children volunteer into armed groups because of their socio-political and or socio-economic circumstances. And it's exactly what you're speaking about. In certain areas, some families would, rather than wait for their villages to be pillaged, would give up their children or their girl children to the armed groups to be such and such a leader's wife, for example, as opposed to that person being trafficked and raped outside of marriage. They'll give them to marriage and then they'll be raped. So a lot of terrorist groups as well are coming out of less developed areas of countries, right? And they also use that doctrine of, hey, look at us, we're underdeveloped, and it's because of the way that the government is working, they don't care about us. And then they go out into the villages again and they're like, they don't care about you, so you need to join us. And that is how children end up joining them as well. So you're absolutely right, this does happen, and we do need to, I guess, deal with the root causes, right? So you're absolutely right that we would have to deal with, because like I said now, a lot of it is coming out of the less developed areas of countries. So we do need to deal with the development in those areas. But in states that are federal, it's a bit more different. You know, it's not as easy there to deal with certain things because, you know, you have as many different laws as there are states within that country. However, I think that, yes, to deal with food security and education and health and such would also help to mitigate the issue, because those are the exact things that armed groups dangle in their faces, you know, in the faces of the children. Hi, come with us, you'll get security. Hi, come with us, your family will be safe, and so on. So yes, you're right. This is something that happens and something that needs to be dealt with.
Thank you for your question, Thabang. And if you have one as well, we've got just over 5 minutes left. So do get your question into the comment section as well. I was really interested to hear you say about the reasons children are now being recruited into armed conflict at a higher rate than previously. And one of the big factors you said was because it draws international attention. So that made me question, what does it say about the media's role in covering these conflicts?
That's very true. So when I was in my final year of high school, there was this YouTube group that was chasing Coney, and they were raising funds by posting their YouTube videos. But then because they were posting, he was running away and such, and they never caught him. But that's one of the people whom I don't think governments are interested in catching, because surely, surely by now, someone in East Africa would have captured Coney, you know? But when I was in high school, I saw this thing and I was like, wow, okay, so, you know, media attention actually helps. We look at Boko Haram. Boko Haram were like, oh my goodness, what have you done? You've kidnapped so many girls all at once overnight. What is this? And that's exactly why they did it. So the media, I think, does play a role in letting us know what is going on, right? And that is exactly why they implement this strategy. But then we need to also take the baton from the media and then do something about it now that we know about it. I don't know how long the Nigerian government knew about Boko Haram and their issues that they were causing before I learned about the Chibok girls, for example. But now that we know about it, Nigeria should have felt embarrassed and, you know, gone and done something about it. DRC as well, you know, once they told us about what's happening in the Kivus with regard to our cell phones and stuff, DRC should have felt embarrassed and gone and done something about it. So the media does have a role in letting us know, but I think that that is as much as we can expect from them. They need to let us know wherever they can, whenever they can, and then we need to then do something about what we've recently found out.
Thank you. And what brought you to this work? How did that passion arise?
Oh, it found me. It found me because, so I work with the Children's Rights Project at the Dula Oma Institute, and we do some work for the African Children's Committee. And one of the areas of research right now is on children affected by armed conflict. So that's how we ended up here. So we're drafting a general comment on Article 22. We're doing a background study on terrorism. And then I personally am heading the team that is drafting a model law on children affected by armed conflict. These are three major projects all happening at once, which is what I was saying, that the committee is very late in its efforts, but we hope that, you know, they're gonna catch up. So this work found me, and I will not lie, it sometimes makes me very sad. It weighs me down, because when you're reading the numbers, for example, I was going through the UN Special Rapporteur's latest report for 2019, and you're just reading about how many children were raped, how many children were found, how many children are still out there, how many children were, you know, maimed, how many children were murdered, and you see it in numbers and you're like, I don't know any of their names, but good heavens, you know. And just when you imagine just the trauma, I always think to myself, if I'm feeling this way just by reading this data, imagine the child in that position, you know, the trauma of going through whatever you're going through. And sadly, a lot of communities don't want the children to be reintegrated into the communities, especially the girl child. They don't want them to be reintegrated into those communities. So that's how the work found me, and it keeps finding me. And so that's why now it's become another niche area. It used to be just education, but now I speak on armed conflict as well.
Well, you took my next question out of my mouth, because I was wondering just that, when you were listing in your talk all the places where there's the armed conflicts and some of the consequences of that for children. I mean, I was thinking in my mind, yeah, but you know exactly what that means in terms of what's happening on the ground to these children. Just a maybe final question, because we're almost out of time. A lot of people, especially in the global north, like to do and want to do something to help. And one of the ways they do that is by giving money to a charity. I wonder if you have any advice or any thoughts on what is the best way to actually contribute to reducing children's involvement in armed conflict?
I think that right now the best thing we can do is to work on the rehabilitation centers. I think that that is something that is very important, but it's also really neglected. You know, we need to, it's very important also to work on, of course, the socio-political and socioeconomic factors, right, that lead children to be kidnapped or to volunteer themselves to being part of an armed group. So where you can, for example, invest in one of the, one of the socio-political, more rather the socio-economic factors which are lacking in a certain area, then I think that that is something you can do. However, I think that rehabilitation centers are also very, very important, because a lot of children will come back and then they will go back. So they'll come back to their communities for a while, then they'll go back because they've not gone through the proper rehabilitation process, and or because the socioeconomic factors which drove them to the conflict are still present. So those two things, investing in socioeconomic structures and investing in rehabilitation centers.
Thank you, Thandeka. That was so comprehensive. We've reached the end of our time. We could go on all day, but we can't, because there is a talk coming right up with Richard Moyes, and the title of his talk is Killing People in the Future, ? So I'll be handing over in just a moment, but a final thank you to you, Thandeka, and thank you for being here and sharing all of your knowledge.